Okay, hello. Thank you all for coming out this evening. It's great to see all of you here. This is the first in the CCT seminar series for this semester. And I'm really happy to have here Josh Cohen, all the way from London. He's from Goldsmiths. He's a professor of modern literary theory there, and he's also a practicing psychoanalyst. His most recent book is on privacy and touching on themes of psychoanalysis, literature, and contemporary culture. And he was actually on the BBC's Moral Maze most recent episode of that. So if you want to catch him, he was by far the most penetrating and insightful contributor, which may or may not be a compliment. I don't know. But if you're a fan of that show, as I am, do check out his contributions there. But his current work is on the place of inertia and lassitude in the history of culture and ideas. And his paper for us tonight then will be on sluggishness, and I think he'll be talking on topics ranging from Homer Simpson to Freud and Bataille to the dude. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing that. So thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Aidan. Yes, that puts it well. This is a kind of hopefully articulated fragments, but fragments of a work in progress. So it moves fairly freewheelingly between bits of cultural history and theory and pop culture commentary, and possibly at times between different registers. It's part of a book in progress. Well, I can say more about it if you have any questions about it afterwards. I'll start the paper proper. So, we are witnesses today to a massive investment in the conception of the human being as, first of all and in all senses, a working being. If there exists in us an inertial resistance to perpetual activity, it is forcefully denied across politics, commerce, and popular culture. Working, understood as both labour and functionality, is now the great imperative of our time. In the UK and US, successive governments, left and right of centre, have been intent on keeping us all busy from as early to as late in life as possible. There is increasing public advocacy of the extension of literacy and numeracy assessments to children as young as 2. Government and corporations in both countries are agitating to raise the retirement age to 70. Disability benefits in the UK and social security benefits in the US have been heavily cut amid ever more stringent and ill-informed bureaucratic assessment. Those pockets of the life cycle protected from demands to learn, work and produce are being rapidly eliminated. And running in concert with this political drive to ensure we're all hard at work is a culture of permanent distraction. No sooner is a child born today than her nervous system is engulfed by an unremitting stream of stimuli beaming from a total environment or a fourth dimension of online life. It's making a reference there to the title of Lawrence Scott's recent book on online life. Inserting her and those around her into another universe, even as they appear to be occupying this one. The space for inactivity and stillness, for time spent without immediate purpose, is being closed down. In the words of cultural theorist Jonathan Crary, nothing is ever fundamentally off, and there's never an actual state of rest. Every moment of a given day, every phase of a given life must be accounted for. Idle time, time without content, provokes fear and contempt. Of course, ours is hardly the first culture to repudiate idleness. From the Bible's reproaches and warnings to the sluggard, to our tabloids' bilious rages against economic migrants and benefit cheats, idleness and sluggishness have long been a source of dire prophecy and bitter invective. In the popular imagination, the shiftless slob provides a lightning rod for our resentment towards those who would live easier lives at our expense. But that which we outwardly reject, Freud reminds us, is also the repository of our secret desires. The slob may be the object of our mockery and disgust, but equally a source of admiration and envy. A gallery of drunken louts, Trimalchio, Chaucer's Miller, Falstaff, of spacey fantasies, Don Quixote or Snoopy, hopeless slackers, Goncharov's Oblomov, the Dude, Lebowski, and entitled slobs, Diderot's Rameau, Homer Simpson, attest to the enduring status of the sluggish in the history of Western culture. So how is it that a civilization so devoted to the ideal of work could be so enchanted by these figures of pure indolence? Each of these opposing impulses are allied to one of two principles of mental functioning, the title of a famous 1910 essay by Freud. The first of these, the pleasure principle, is geared towards the elimination of tension, achieved only when we get what we want. If we're hungry or sexually aroused, we discharge the onrush of libido and the excitement that accompanies it by a meal or an orgasm. Pleasure, in other words, resides not in the stimulus itself, but in the even state induced when it's discharged. But the management of all libidinal flows in this way would consign us to a permanent alternation of excitement and exhaustion, making it very difficult to get anything achieved, to work. We need to keep some of our energy in reserve in order to manage the tasks of living. With the emergence of the reality principle, the second of Freud's famous two principles, the mind comes to benefit from the pragmatic gains of delaying gratification. The more strongly the reality principle can entrench itself in us, the higher the degree of mastery we can exert over ourselves and the world. Freud saw the scientist, understood in the broadest sense as the dispassionate seeker after truth, as the person in whom the reality principle is most fully developed. Science demands the discipline of waiting patiently, of doing without the gratifications of certainty. Science is hard work because it operates in reality, and in reality there are no shortcuts. Freud's adherence to the superiority of the scientific orientation to the world places him squarely in the Enlightenment tradition of rationality and moral self-discipline. But he equally rejects the Enlightenment's flattering conception of the human being as given inherently to reason and virtue. On the contrary, in the deepest cells of ourselves, he suggests, we are servants of the pleasure principle, seeking the most easeful and untroubled possible path through life. In the first instance, we're all slobs, enthralled to a profound psychic inertia. What Freud will call, and I'll say more about this, the sluggishness of the libido. It's only gradually and unwillingly that we learn to accommodate ourselves to external reality and the limits it imposes. The inertial psychic state has a steady and constant presence throughout the Freudian corpus. It takes a central place at various points in the Fleece correspondence, and most notably in the so-called project of 1895. At the very beginning of this attempt, in Freud's own view an abortive one, to develop a neurological basis for his emerging psychology of defense, he argues that inertia is the founding principle of the nervous system. The organism seeks to discharge any quantity of stimulus it absorbs from the world outside, a tendency he calls, in 1895, neuronal inertia. But this tendency quickly encounters a difficulty. While the organism can withdraw from people, things, sights and sounds, from any external stimuli, it cannot withdraw from internal excitations, hunger, sexual arousal, as we've mentioned. The nervous system is thus obliged to abandon its commitment to absolute inertia, the reduction of stimulus to zero, for the more compromised aim of keeping the flow of stimulus as low and even as possible, a formula that will, of course, come to be known as the pleasure principle. 11 years earlier, the decadent French writer J.K. Huysmans had published his classic A Rebours, Against Nature. The tragicomic trials of its protagonist, Des Esseintes, centre on his desperate attempts to return his body and his psyche, ravaged by debauched sexual and narcotic excesses, to a state of undisturbed quiescence, to achieve, that is, something like neuronal inertia. In the isolation of his suburban villa outside Paris, he transforms the ground floor into a massive trompe-l'oeil that combines the appearance of a monastic asceticism with a feel of enveloping luxuriousness. Like an eremite, writes the narrator of his protagonist, he was ripe for solitude, exhausted by life, and expecting nothing more of it. Like a monk again, he was overwhelmed by an immense weariness, by a longing for peace of quiet, by a desire to have no further contact with the heathen. But this very longing for peace and quiet can only give rise to its opposite. Every diversion Des Esseintes contrives to defend against the disturbances of overexcitement or debilitating lethargy ends up precipitating one or both of them. Seen through the lens of Freudian economics, the problem is that excitement must rise before it can fall. The path to quiescence is forced to endure a detour of heightened tension. The result of this pull between extremes is something like Des Esseintes' immense weariness, in which the self's very yearning for peace renders it more vulnerable to intense innovation. The exemplary instance of inertia is sleep, as Freud construes it in his 1917 paper, A Metapsychological Supplement to the Theory of Dreams. Sleep, Freud suggests here, is the normal counterpart of the pathological tendency in dementia praecox, or paraphrenia, to withdraw all cathexes of the external world, the preconscious and the unconscious. The wish to sleep, writes Freud, endeavours to draw in all the cathexes sent out by the ego and to establish an absolute narcissism. An absolute narcissism is a radically hermetic self-enclosure of the ego, from which all emanations of external and internal otherness are barred. But absolute narcissism, and the state of absolute inertia which would accompany it, are never fully achieved by sleep. The unconscious refuses to comply with the ego's wish to sleep, resulting in the great compromise we call dreaming. Indeed, dreams, writes Freud, only show us the dreamer insofar as he is not sleeping. Dreams, that is, are a pocket of psychic wakefulness within sleep, a counter-cathexis of the sleeping ego's aim of annulling all activity in the mind. In this respect, sleep can be thought of as a residue of the earliest form of drive life, as adumbrated in Beyond the Pleasure Principles, startling narrative of biological prehistory. Life, Freud speculates, began when some force, of whose nature he says we can have no conception, insinuated itself into the inanimate. But in Freud's account, matter resents this intrusion of life into its cells and seeks immediately to cancel itself out, to return to the state of dead matter. In this way, the first drive came into being, the drive to return to an inanimate state. The drive's first aim is its own extinction. Absolute inertia realized would be less death than deadness, a psyche emptied of all investments, all objects. As Andre Green suggests, Freud was partially in error when he assimilated narcissism as a self-preservative drive to eros later on, in the 30s, for this is to conflate narcissism with a positive narcissism that seeks to extend, develop, and nurture the ego, and so to overlook the negative narcissism whose tendency is towards non-existence, anesthesia, emptiness, the blanc. To complicate matters still further, it turns out that there's a pull towards inertia even in the life force itself. Eros, Freud argues in Civilization and Its Discontents, impels the process of the organism's ongoing expansion and integration into ever larger unities, from individuals and families to races, peoples, nations, and finally humankind as such. But sexual love, though no less under the rule of Eros, so both the sort of biological impulse to self-expansion and aggrandizement and love appear to be under the rule of Eros, and yet sexual love puts a spoke in the wheels of unifying civilizational progress. Having achieved in it his essential purpose, he being Eros, having achieved in it his essential purpose of making one out of more than one, Eros then mysteriously refuses to go further. Lovers violently reject the intrusion of the third and its intimation of a world beyond themselves. So lovers refuse to go further. This refusal Freud ascribes to the inertia of the libido. Libidinal or psychical inertia is a synonym for fixation, a disinclination to give up an old position for a new one, which in fact is, as I'm sure many of you will know, also Freud's definition of the perversion, a disinclination to give up an old position for a new one. It designates, in the memorable phrase of the 1937 outline, a sluggishness of the libido, a lassitude internal to the sexual drive itself. Eros at once presses us forward into the future and pulls us back into proximity to the drive's earliest desire to cancel itself out. It is both the work by which the species expands outward and the inertia that contracts it inward. The sexual couple, then, is both the primary denominator of the species' multiplication and its obstruction. Freud's point is that this expansive impulse is just one dimension of the couple, forever shadowed by a contractive impulse to merge into one another, to fend off the external world, a kind of libidinal counterpart to the state of sleep. We're so used to thinking of passions as active and purposeful, we fail to notice how lazy and complacent they become. We picture libido as a fuel coursing abundantly, speedily, and without resistance through a roaring engine, not as a sludge sliding slowly and heavily down a fuel pipe, blocking the carburetor, causing the engine to sputter out. We're very alive to the dynamism of the libido, but much less so to the sluggishness of the libido. Passion and desire have become so inextricably bound up in our minds with doing that the notion of a passion for inactivity or slowness, or, in Bartleby's famous phrase for preferring not to, is barely intelligible to us. The idea of a sluggishness built into the libido offers a radical challenge to our received notions of human life and selfhood. In conceiving ourselves so narrowly as creatures of action and purpose, in insisting we put all our time to work, we are effectively declaring war on an essential dimension of ourselves, depriving ourselves of what Donald Winnicott calls the simplest of all experiences, the experience of being. Winnicott uses this simple yet enigmatic word to describe the inner life of a baby who hasn't yet differentiated herself from her mother. It's from this diffuse, unorganized experience of being that our sense of selfhood eventually emerges. But as we come to identify ourselves, or rather confuse ourselves, with the psychologically developed self who consciously thinks and acts, this original layer of psychic life becomes increasingly inaccessible to us. As the American psychoanalyst and academic Jonathan Lear points out, in his tendency to ascribe functions and purposes to all activities of the mind, however incomprehensible they may seem, Freud seems implicitly to endorse this conception of the human being as a creature of doing. This is true even where we appear to act in ways that damage us or undermine our own interests. Underlying this insistence on the rationality of our most extreme psychic and behavioral tendencies is an implicit teleology of the mind and a conviction that whatever we do has a purpose, however concealed from us it may be. What's missed by such a thinking is the possibility that, in Lear's words, some mental activity occurs without a purpose. We may contain within us, alongside the drive to act and fulfill worldly ambitions, a more discreet but equally powerful tendency to refuse action and ambition. Recognizing such a tendency has profoundly political as well as psychological implications. Our alienation from this impulse might give us a clue as to why the slob A figure so apparently harmless and easygoing should so often be an object of fear and disgust, although of admiration sometimes as well. Perhaps we sense in him some hated and long-renounced dimension of ourselves. The word's origin is instructive here. Slob dates from the late 18th century and derived from the Irish word slab, meaning mud, or in its Anglo-Irish variant sludge, or ooze. Dignity, perhaps the most cherished of human ideals, is personified in the body's upright bearing. An oft-repeated speculation of Freud's has it that in the evolution of our species, our heads were originally in close proximity to our anal and genital organs. In setting them at a distance, evolution encouraged us to disown our animal origins, to renounce our dog-like shamelessness with regards to excretion and sex. Straightening our backs and tilting our chins up towards the firmament, the erect posture freed our heads from the disgusting and arousing smells of our intimate bodily selves. Cleaving to the ground, we were slaves of chaotic and untamable matter. Raised into the air, we acquired the order and discipline of form. The slob disturbs us because he puts us in touch with that formless, muddy region of the self we thought we had risen above. You feel it when you sink exhaustedly into the sofa, abandoning your jaw and muscles and internal organs to gravity's inexorable downward pull. You feel it when your mind, in solidarity with this collapse of bodily form, yields to its own sludgy undertow of blank stupidity, French bêtise, beast-like, when all your inner voice can do is hum moronic advertising jingles. How can you possibly pick things up when you are on the level of a thing yourself, dumb, inert, and useless? In 1929, with Europe on the verge of sinking into a mire of destruction, Georges Bataille cast grave doubt on any notion of a benign order of nature. Humanity, he suggested, has long laboured under the comforting illusion of biological life as tending upwards. With their feet in the mud, but their heads more or less in light, men obstinately imagine a tide that will permanently elevate them. So you have their kind of nicely ironic rewriting of Wilde's famous formulation about being the gutter and looking at the stars. Bataille sort of, it rather cheekily, given that Wilde's great trope is inversion, he inverts Wilde. In moments of slobbishness, this elevated position of our head gives way to the mud, the slab, below, taunting us with the possibility that the only way is down, that human dignity is only a sentimental illusion. We like to think of ourselves on the model of a tree, standing tall, enduring through time, our upright stance the embodiment of our moral as well as physical rectitude. The slob shows us to ourselves instead in the image of the plant which, writes Bataille, rises in the direction of the sun and then collapses in the direction of the ground. Our alienation from this impulse might give us a clue as to why the slob is so often an object of fear and disgust. Bataille's 1929 essay in Document sees this secret downward pull of matter on the elevated aspirations of humanity symbolically displaced in its language of flowers. The flower is an image at once of the human aspiration to the sublimity of the Most High and of the gravitational pull towards the lowest. Risen from the stench of the manure pile, this is Bataille, risen from the stench of the manure pile, even though it seemed for a moment to have escaped it in a flight of angelic and lyrical purity, the flower seems to relapse abruptly into its original squalor. Flowers wither like old and overly made-up dowagers, and they die ridiculously on stems that seem to carry them to the clouds. There may be quite a lot to say, although I'm not saying it here, about the weird insinuation of misogyny into Bataille's description, and the way that it actually slots itself, consciously or not, into a lineage of associations of women with sluggishness, particularly, in fact, in most prominently in French Orientalism. We are often roused from a state of stupor with a start, as though in our sunken reverie we'd perceived something horribly alarming. The alarm might find concrete expression in the fear that we've left the bath running or the iron on. That is, in a premonition of flooding or fire that would wash or burn away our home and our world. Does this foreboding translate some image, screened on the inner wall of our cranium as we drifted off, of an earth without form and void, tohu vavohu, the dark chaos which, according to the opening of Genesis, preceded God's creation of the world? When we surrender to lassitude, it's as though the forms that bind and support the world fall away, exposing the obscure void beneath. We're put in touch with the universe as, in Bataille's word, formless, sluggish, lacking in any shape or structure. Base matter, that's Bataille's term for a kind of radically non-ideal conception of matter. Base matter corrodes the concept that seeks to grasp and shape it. External and foreign to ideal human aspirations, its nauseating formlessness defies all attempts to bestow it with the dignity of representational form. Bataille recognises in Picasso a willingness to subject the artwork to the downward force of squalor, a willingness that will come to drive a particular itinerary of modern art, identified by the art historians and theorists Rosalind Krauss and Yves-Alain Bois in their Pompidou show and its accompanying book of 1996, L'informe, or Formless. One privileged instance of this downward movement is identified by them in the series Liquid Words, a series of paintings from the late 60s by the American artist Ed Ruscha. And that one is called Hey.
Shall I?
Yeah, go on. Bois writes of these paintings that they reverse the expected process of the articulation of paint or ink into dried out words, showing us instead, says Bois, the melting of the letters, their more or less slow fusion into a state of indifferentiation. Before these paintings we bear witness to a liquefaction of meaning, to whatever in language makes it into matter, everything that escapes idealization. The paintings freeze the words at the threshold of their congealment into formless viscosity. Hey, this minimal unit of address or effective expression, normally a kind of gateway to the possibilities of human communication, undergoes its sluggish self-transformation in this painting. Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah. In 1999, in the midst of so many millennial anxieties, Tracey Emin was nominated for the Turner Prize. Her contribution to the prize exhibition at the Tate, drawing teeming crowds of fascinated, baffled, and often angry visitors, was My Bed, in which she presented the titular bed in its supposed exact state following an alcohol-fueled breakdown triggered by the end of a relationship. A disordered tangle of used stockings, towels, and sheets, the undersheets spilling freely over the bed's base, was bordered by the accumulated debris of an exhausted life, a lonely, cuddly toy, used and unused tissues and tampons, condoms and condiments, aspirin and alcohol. My Bed generated a storm of familiar tabloid ridicule and contempt. What did this display of life's raw mess, this indulgent and aggressive act of self-exposure, have to do with art? Concealed in all the contrived outrage and disgust was an interesting, if familiar, question. How can we confer the status of an artwork on an object that seems brazenly to refuse the terms of both art and work? The word poiesis defines the creative act, whether in natural or human life, as a making, a transfiguration through work of one thing into another. Informally known as her unmade bed, not only did Emin's bed show no evidence of being made, it seemed to be the statement of a refusal to make anything. Its startling gesture was to leave the formless detritus of her disintegrating life undisturbed, strewn with no thought as to their harmonious arrangement or to inducing aesthetic pleasure in her viewer. That this impression of disintegration was actually the effect of painstaking and artful work on Emin's part only amplifies its shocking indifference to the task of pleasing us. This is work that refuses to do any work, intent on cancelling out its own efforts. It's just a close-up. My bed served as a lightning rod for the rage and disgust as well as resentment that the inertial state is apt to provoke. The noisy hatred and fascination with which it was greeted suggests the profoundly ambiguous status of the sluggish state. Our journeys to work are cast in the shadow of advertising hoardings emblazoned with images of taut, oiled limbs and glassy faces basking in the sun, stirring our desperate envy and longing as we stare down the barrel of the grinding day to come. In such moments, the idle state seems the most desirable and precious commodity, the Sabbath that would restore us to the world, enabling us to work and love again. But sluggishness is also the demonic rebel against the parties of love and work, the siren call to forget the world and fall into the voluptuous embrace of oblivion. This oblivion, made so unnervingly palpable by Emin's bed, is not the divinely sanctioned rest of the Sabbath, which prepares our return the following day to the dutiful service of God, work and family. It is closer to the tohu vavohu of Genesis that preceded the creation of the world, the base matter that precedes the intervention of the idea or word. Emin's bed provokes a horrified recognition of a scene playing itself invisibly and secretly in us. In the midst of our purposeful lives of action and progress, it hints at the wish to surrender to entropy, to the dissolution of all order and meaning of life itself. The great thinkers of the Enlightenment spend much time engaged in a war against sluggishness. Ourselves, they posited, like our civilization, may undergo an infancy defined by dependence, ignorance, and irrationality, but the arc of the human story is one of progressive movement towards autonomy, knowledge, and reason. The true aim and destiny of the enlightened self is to bring reality under the rule of the intellect, rather than surrender to the dim, childish urgings of pleasure. The slob and waster are, for this reason, the Enlightenment's mortal enemies, at least apparently so. The relationship on the page is, of course, much more ambiguous. The slob's shiftlessness, moral laxity and hedonism are living refutations of its every cherished party. That, at least, is the theory. In practice, many writers and thinkers of this period had a much more ambiguous and complex relationship to the sluggard. An oscillation between disgust and fascination brought to life memorably in Jacques Diderot's fictionalized dialogue, Rameau's Nephew. Diderot is an undisputed giant of the French Enlightenment. The author of an eclectic range of essays and fictions, he's famed above all as the editor of the first great modern encyclopedia, which would include substantial contributions by the most celebrated thinkers and writers of the day, including Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, as well as Diderot himself. The encyclopédie is a monument to the grand project of accumulating and disseminating knowledge. Diderot's life and work attests to an unswerving dedication to moral and rational progress, and yet he's also the author of Jacques the Fatalist, a novel comprising of a rambling dialogue between a valet and his nameless master, one of literature's great homages to the joys of aimless chatter, and a sustained joke on the very idea of rational narrative progress. And perhaps his greatest literary creation is an epic slob and waster. Like many of Plato's dialogue, Rameau's Nephew begins with a chance encounter that leads to an extended disputation on how to live. Unlike in Plato, the leading voice in the dialogue speaks not in the name of wisdom and virtue, but of dishonesty and vice. Rameau is a music teacher, and, says Diderot, one of the weirdest characters in this land of ours where God has not been sparing of them. Diderot meets him in an idle moment of his own, taking shelter from the cold and rain in the Café de la Régence, watching a game of chess. Their talk soon turns to Rameau's difficulties. He lives by sponging off rich households into which he insinuates himself by means of flattery and deceit, and from which he's inevitably ejected for overstepping the mark. Diderot listens to his defence of an amoral, self-indulgent, dependent, and thoroughly useless life, with both outward disgust and surreptitious amusement, even admiration. There is a knowingly perfunctory quality to Diderot's objections, a sense that he's enjoying his interlocutor's perverse self-justifications too much to spoil them with serious counter-arguments. In any case, there is nothing Diderot can say about Rameau that Rameau hasn't already said of himself. Diderot calls him an idler, greedy, cowardly, and with a soul of dirt, to which Rameau replies with the shamelessness peculiar to the slob, "I believe I've told you that already." Forever ducking and diving, he fantasizes a future in which he will squander untold riches on women and drink, while paying back all the humiliations he suffered at the hands of his aristocratic paymasters. Diderot lavishes witheringly ironic praise on this worthy use you would make of wealth. You would be most useful to your fellow citizens and most glorious to yourself. But Rameau is immune to such irony. The virtues of honour, seriousness, and usefulness with which Diderot reproaches him are for Rameau mere vanities, empty words hiding under the pretentious cover of universal laws. In a brazen travesty of Solomon's wisdom, he commends Diderot to drink good wine, blow yourself out with luscious food, have a tumble with lovely women, lie on soft beds. Apart from that, the rest is vanity. Rameau is a bombastic spokesman for the supremacy of the pleasure principle. The sequence of the pleasures he lists reveals the sensual pleasures of good wine, luscious food, and lovely women to be mere way stations on the journey to a soft bed, the blissful annulment of all mental and physical effort. The ultimate end of pleasure, at least as Rameau and Freud see it, is not arousal, but peace. And the problem with the virtual life for which Diderot speaks is that it refuses to leave you in peace. It requires self-denial, discipline, a vigilant attention to the intentions and effects of your own thoughts and actions. Uprightness. It's a persecutory voice, insistently calling you out for your irresponsibility and selfishness. Not only are you ignorant of the virtuous life, Diderot chides, you are not even capable of learning. All the better, replies Rameau. It had pegged me out through hunger, boredom, and remorse. To train oneself to bear a life poor in food, amusement, and rich in self-reproach, says Rameau, is entirely self-defeating. It means embracing rather than minimizing privations, willfully denying yourself what you want. The dialogue suspends us, like Diderot himself, between repulsion and attraction. Rameau's prescription for life, to give nothing and demand everything, is morally and logically outrageous. Yet, it's hard not to be seduced by the cheek and exuberance with which he defends the indefensible, not to surrender to the finally unanswerable logic that says a difficult life is not preferable to an easy one. In ventriloquizing him so seductively, Diderot brings us into contact with a universally concealed Rameau, with a big tyrannical baby who rails against the obstacles reality puts in the way of contentment, who doesn't see why he should be asked to wait, to work, to be responsible. Rameau appeals to us because he dares give voice to the entitled slobs that in most of us live a more shamed and furtive existence. In his dedicated profligacy, we can discern the generous outlines of the Rameau of our own day, our living homage to sloth, waste, irresponsibility, and infantile gratification. Homer Simpson. So I'm going to take a bit of time to talk about Homer Simpson. Snoopy, Garfield, Homer, why should cartoons be such a fertile breeding ground for iconic slobs and wasters? The large chunk of childhood I happily squandered reading and watching cartoons showed me the secret affinity between the two. Slobs are such stock figures in cartoons because cartoons, for all the painstaking work involved in their production, are the fruit of the most sluggish region of our imagination. This may seem a counterintuitive claim. The creations of Tex Avery or Hanna-Barbera are alive with manic energy, every frame a frenzied overspill of noise, violence, and joy. But this is exactly what makes watching them such a blissfully sedentary activity. Bugs, Daffy, Tom, Jerry live in a world from which the tiresome constraints of reality, of physical laws, morality, death, have been conveniently expunged. Maurice Blanchot notes that the closest approximation in our experience to a world freed from the impositions of reality is the world of artistic creation. The artist, he writes, seems to be subjected to a state of inactivity because he is the master of the imaginary. The truth is that he ruins action, not because he deals with what is unreal, but because he makes all reality available to us. In the realm of the imaginary, one can do and undo anything, and no art form brings this home to us more vividly and insistently than cartoon animation. Real life is hard work because there is so much that gets in the way of what we would like to do. Cartoon life removes all the obstacles of reality, the limitations of our bodies and minds, as well as of the physical and social worlds, inviting us into a world where we can create and destroy anything without effort, where Rameau's bugbears of hunger, boredom, and remorse have evaporated. Cats and ducks and people can be sliced, inflated, stretched, exploded, burnt, and beaten with ease and impunity, unimpeded by the joyless finger-wagging of conscience or logic. This is actually quite close, I think, to Blanchot's reading of Sade. And I think one way of reading Sade might be to read him alongside and in the light of the cartoon. This is how Homer's slobbery can happily coexist with a manic excess of activity. He can become an astronaut, rock star, hobo, or mafioso without any of the annoying prerequisites of training or experience. Homer embodies the fundamental affinity between the slob and the cartoon, the fantasy that you can do anything without having to do anything. Episodes of The Simpsons often centre on Homer's shameless craving for inactivity and the comically circuitous routes he travels down to achieve it. He becomes morbidly obese in order to gain eligibility for disability benefits, turning his life into one long renunciation of reason and purpose. In a Treehouse of Horror segment following his ingestion of intergalactic goo, he morphs into a voracious cannibalistic blob, a Swiftian embodiment of pure consumption. Homer is something like a pop cultural incarnation of the vision of Bataille's sovereign man, in whom the drive to produce is swallowed whole by the drive to consume. The lurid, faintly urinal glow of warm colours, suffusing the characters, is a kind of atmospheric analogue to the nirvana of inanity bestowed by a bottomless abundance of Duff beer and lard donuts. These are the colours of contented suburban decadence, the landscape of easy gratification and casual waste. Perhaps this is why the show is so enamoured of scenarios of apocalyptic environmental despoliation, usually triggered by Homer. In one of the most uncompromisingly nihilistic episodes, Homer's aversion to disposing of his own garbage spurs him to stand successfully for election as Springfield's sanitation commissioner, winning over town hall meetings with the slogan, "Can't someone else do it?" Homer's laxity and wastefulness spread contagiously through the townsfolk, whose sanitation service now eliminates not only garbage, but any need for self-care. In an inspired fantasy of collective civic sluggishness, men in epauleted sailor suits appear from nowhere to wipe sauce off the front of your search or dispose discreetly of your old porn stash. Inevitably, Homer's solution can only proliferate the waste he was elected to contain. He blows his office's full annual budget in a month and resolves the crisis by leasing the town's disused mines as an outsourced landfill for cities across America. The whole of Springfield promptly becomes a putrid dump, its parks, golf courses, and eventually town hall itself gushing waste from geysers of backed-up trash. The town is left with no choice but to transport itself wholesale 5 miles down the road. The episode presents Homer as the harbinger of the world's return to a state of chaotic formlessness. His campaign may mimic the conventional rhetoric of a can-do politics geared towards fulfilling efficient goals, but it conceals an underlying nihilism and irrationality that threatens the fall of the very structures holding up the world. Homer shows us why sluggishness is simultaneously venerated and resented. Confronted by the imperative to face reality as it is, he yells, "Can't someone else do it?" and sinks ever more defiantly into the life of aimless sloth the rest of us have been forced, resentfully, to renounce.